Welcome to Story Chat Radio. We are book editors Carly Hayward and Jenny Chappell. Every month we watch a different movie with an eye for storytelling and novel writing.
We use our years of training and experience editing novels to break down each movie's storytelling elements to help you improve your novel in progress.
Warning, Jenny ruins everything.
Hey, you ruin things too.
So don't be surprised if there are spoilers.
On this episode of the podcast, we are discussing the mother of all YA dystopian, The Hunger Games.
All right, here come the spoilers. Every year as punishment for a failed revolt, the 12 districts of Pan Am are forced to send one boy and one girl between the ages of 12 and 18 to fight to the death in the annual televised Hunger Games until there is only one survivor. When her younger sister is chosen to fight for District 12, 16-year-old Katniss Everdeen volunteers to take her place. She and fellow tribute Peeta travel to the capital, where they must train and work to gain sponsors who can provide potentially life-saving gifts during the games. Only 11 tributes, including Katniss, Peeta, and the careers, who are the tributes from the two richest districts, survive the first day. Katniss tries to stay away from the others, but when the careers corner her, she uses a nest of genetically modified venomous wasps to drive them away, thanks to a tip by the young tribute Rue. Katniss is also stung a few times, and as Rue helps her recover, they become friends and allies. Katniss later finds and frees Rue from a trap, but another tribute then kills Rue. Her death then triggers a riot in her home district. To pacify the public, the head of the game, Seneca, changes the rules to allow 2 winners, provided they are from the same district. After the announcement, Katniss finds a gravely wounded Peeta, and another announcement promises that what each survivor needs the most will be provided the next morning. Despite Peeta's vehement opposition, Katniss gets medicine for him, narrowly avoiding being killed in the process. The medicine heals Peeta overnight. Then, genetically modified beasts force Katniss, Peeta, and Cato, the last 3 survivors, to climb onto the cornucopia's roof, which is the center of the games. Cato gets Peeta in a headlock and uses him as a human shield against Katniss's bow. Peeta directs Katniss to shoot Cato's hand, enabling Peeta to throw him to the beasts. Katniss kills him with an arrow to end his suffering. When Seneca revokes the rule change allowing 2 victors, Katniss convinces Peeta to eat poisonous berries together. Just before they do, they're declared co-victors, but Katniss has made enemies through her acts of defiance. Whew. Okay, so Jenny, what did you think of this movie?
So it was a lot of fun to rewatch this now that it's achieved like classic status.
Mm-hmm.
I always think of this as being from like just a couple years ago, but it totally is not.
Yeah. What year is it from? Do you remember?
I think the movie came out in 2012. So the book
Nice.
was already, yeah, exactly. Do you feel old yet? So yeah, with the new movie coming out, it seems like YA dystopian is kind of coming back around, which means like new, fresh twists, which is always super exciting. Which, by the way, listeners, if you are one of the authors working on a YA dystopian right now, it might be helpful to go back and listen to our episode on retellings. Not that yours will be like a strict retelling, but it'll help you think about how to make sure yours does feel like new and fresh.
Yep, good idea.
Anyway, it was really great to go back to this story for like a solid YA dystopian. The acting is amazing. The costumes and sets are fabulous. District 12 was filmed like 10 minutes from where I live.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. You know, like all of the like poor rundown. That part was filmed near me. The part that looks like the Great Depression.
Great. Great.
Right. Yeah, and the costumes, oh my gosh, like all of the stuff with like their clothes being on fake fire and stuff. Like I know that Alicia Keys' song "Girl on Fire" isn't about Katniss, but that's always what I
Isn't
think
it
of when I
though?
see her in that
Yeah.
fire dress.
Yeah.
Like they even call her the Girl on Fire. Like this does
I'm
not
pretty
seem
sure.
right. I know. Seeing baby Jennifer Lawrence was awesome too. Like she's had
Yeah.
such a career since then. And this was really like one of the things that really launched her into being famous.
Yeah.
Okay, but really the truth is this was a really hard rewatch for me because like I knew what was coming and I had to kind of skip all the stuff with Rue
Ah.
because I am still kind of traumatized from the first time I saw it.
Yeah.
Like it hit me hard. The whole premise of this is already horrific enough when you stop and actually put thought into it. But man, that part just guts me. Like, yeah. And I mean, I know that's the point, right? Like, it's
It
giving
is.
us real stakes. It's really showing us how horrific all of this is. But, like, yeah, if I had watched that, I would still be, like, huddled in a ball in the corner sobbing right now. But beyond that, love the movie. I think there's just so much here to really love. So, yeah, what did you think?
Yeah, let's not talk about Rue. It's too heartbreaking. But beyond that, I had fun rewatching it. I feel like Hunger Games had become a bit of kind of a rote thing in my
Yeah.
head.
Yeah.
Like something that's been riffed on so much that it kind of lost any of its allure or shine.
Sure.
But rewatching it, it was like, oh, right, this is actually really good and enjoyable and interesting.
Yeah.
I kind of forgot how good it is. Which I feel like can happen with a lot of like new quote
Totally.
unquote classics. You go through that period where you're sick of them or so overly saturated with them. So it was nice to get like refreshed on it and
Yeah.
kind of be excited about it. I did spend the whole time thinking about Cinna's future, and it being really sad. Like every time he was on screen,
Don't think about it.
it
That
was
doesn't happen in this story.
no.
If it's
But-
not in this movie, it doesn't exist.
I did like knowing though some of the growth that some of the other characters would go through, like Effie Trinket.
Yeah.
It was kind of cool to see her in this and like remember where she's gonna go and like things like
Right.
that. It was an interesting like, oh yeah, I'm excited for that character to grow. How cool. Anyway, it was all good stuff. Definitely worth a rewatch or a watch for the first time if that is somehow still possible for you.
Right. Right.
All right, so what's something this movie does well that writers can use in their own work, Jenny?
Okay, so since this movie is the mother of YA dystopian, it only feels fitting that we talk about how it uses the mother of all story structures.
Oh,
Like, we've been talking about story structure a lot. So,
We have.
yes, friends, I am talking 3-act structure. Ba-ba.
dun dun! Drum roll.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about story structure the last few episodes, but I realized we've never gone over just basic 3-act structure somehow.
That's weird.
Especially considering how much we talk about it. Like, I feel like
Yeah.
we probably talk about it every episode.
We talked about it a little bit in our first structure episode, but like not
Yeah.
exclusively.
Right, right. So we are past time on this. So like the other structures we've discussed, 3-act structure has like a series of beats, story beats or plot points that guide the story. But unlike some of the others, 3-act structure splits these plot points up evenly over the course of the story so that there's an important shift in direction of the plot every 12.5%. Then between plot points, the tension builds as more obstacles come up in the protagonist's path as a result of their previous actions.
Yep.
So that is the very broad overview. This is one topic that I feel like movies in general are a really great resource for because
Yeah.
almost all movies follow this structure. Even the ones that like otherwise might not get any love from award shows or whatnot. I feel like we've done a really good job on this podcast of like doing a broad variety of different kinds of movies, like things that, you know, we've done some that are like Academy Award, like Oscar bait kind of movies. But we've also done, kids movies, we've done action movies.
try.
And yeah, most of them do follow 3-act structure. This is how Save the Cat came to be like so popular among novelists. The original was written for screenplays, which are movie scripts. And it focuses on 3-act structure, but it breaks it down into like much more specific beats. So I'm not going to go into all of the specifics about the plot points here right now, because we're going to break those down, all the plot points, in a little bit. But before we get into all of that, I do want to talk about percentages for a minute, because I feel like this is one thing that really turns authors off when they first start hearing about 3-act structure. Like in discussions of 3-act structure, there's always this big focus on percentages, which can make the whole thing feel super unapproachable. So basically, the percentage refers to the placement of a certain plot point or beat in the story. And so it's easy to get hung up on that and whether those are exactly where they should be, because they're such precise numbers. Like 12.5% is so precise. But really, that's missing the point. The percentages are really a guide to help you make sure that your pacing is on point. They're intended to ensure that your story has something important happening, like, some twist in the plot, in the main plot, at regular intervals throughout the story, to help you establish that nice kind of peak and valley feel to the tension. So you can also, if it helps, you can look at the percentages as fractions instead.
Would that help? That sounds worse.
Okay, well, here's why I feel like it might help, because 12.5% is like, oh my God, that seems so random. Like,
that's true.
But when you look at it as a fraction, basically you're splitting your story into quarters, and then you split each of those in half. And that's where the 12.5% comes from, is that it's half of 25%. So when you kind of, to me, I don't know, it makes some kind of weird sense in my brain that better. Seems better than like, 12. I don't know.
I get it.
But yeah, like every eighth of the story, or, again, quarters and then halves. It can be page count or word count, kind of whichever works best for you and your story. It's okay if the beginning of the scene is where the important plot point happens. That's where the percentage is. It's okay if the percentage happens at the end of the scene. The point is where like the importance of the scene hits the character. Like it doesn't have to be like this exact thing happens at this exact moment. It isn't they don't have quite to say, as precise as it feels.
Oh no, this happened at the exact moment. It's just
And so one of the things that I was doing as I was watching this and kind of coming up with my talking points was like kind of skimming through the movie and finding those percentages and like what happens. And in this movie, it is not exact. It's not like this exact moment happens at this exact point. It might be a couple of minutes off, or like some of them are like this happens closer to the beginning of, the percentage is actually kind of at the beginning of when this starts to happen, or the percentage is at like closer to the end. Yeah. So it's a lot more flexible than it feels when you say 12.5%, basically. The biggest thing is if it's way off, you might need to step back and evaluate. So even though the numbers are incredibly precise, they really are a lot more flexible than it feels. And it's really more of a way to quantify and externalize the feel of the pacing. So instead of being like, the pacing feels off, like, that's really hard to quantify. What do I do about a feeling, But when you can quantify it, then it gives you something to work with. And so then before we actually start talking about all of this, as always, I just want to say, I feel like this is something that's often best done in revisions, especially when you're a pantser. All of this can be way too hard to approach before you've even drafted your story. Yeah,
just don't even worry about it till at least your first edit.
Yeah. So,
I mean, and
Carly,
also
you talk now.
Well, I find also with that like you will be closer to this than you think you are.
Yes.
It is a natural way to tell stories, and honestly, like doing a reverse outline, which Jenny and I often suggest, and like seeing where these percentages hit, you're going to be pretty close, probably naturally anyway.
Yes. And when it is off, it's normally like you can tell there's like a big
Yes.
part where you have too much information or scenes that aren't really pushing the plot forward or, so it really can be a good guide for that.
It is. All right. So in the past, we've referenced 3-act structure a lot. And you probably will remember that Jenny and I both like to say it's really freaking 4-act structure because Act 2 is split in 2.
Right.
And it's annoying for our brains that they call it 3-act structure. So if I slip up, that's why I don't like it. It doesn't work for my brain, but it works for other people's brains, and that's great. All right, so let's look at these plot points. So we have from 0 to the the 12.5% is the setup, which is that section that Jenny's been talking about. So the setup, this shows the protagonist's normal world, including their emotional wound, and gives clues about where it came from. This doesn't mean you don't have conflict, but the conflict will be more about things that they struggle with all of the time, with a smaller amount focusing on the main plot that you're building. This is a good place to plug our previous episode on Howl's Moving Castle and opening pages. In it, we really talk about how you want to show their world changing in the beginning, but that they could kind of still turn away and go back to their normal life.
Right.
So your first important moment will happen in the first chapter, preferably in the first 5 to 10 pages. And this is often mistaken for the inciting event, but it's more of a hook. And that's kind of what we get into in that episode. It's a smaller event than the actual inciting incident. It's more of what changes in their everyday life that will eventually lead them into the inciting event, which is at 12.5%. The inciting event is the normal world changes as a result of a major conflict. I usually like to think of it as a question of what spurs your character to action here.
Yeah.
Then we get into 25%, which is our first plot point and the end of Act 1. This is usually a context shift, a new piece of information is learned that changes things. It prompts your character to take action and actually really start doing things.
Right.
And then we get into Act 2A, or, what should be Act 2, whatever, at 37.5%, which is your first pinch point.
Or 3/8.
Or 3/8. That's worse. See? I hate that. Okay. The first pinch point is the antagonist exerts new power over the protagonist. So you want to expose your main character to that antagonistic forces to remind them of the conflict that they're up against, basically.
In case they forgot.
You never know.
How. You know how that happens.
You know how they're not constantly worried about it. It's fine.
Totally.
Then we get into 50%, which is your midpoint, or 1/2, or 4/8. The protagonist at your midpoint, the protagonist realizes they can't run away anymore, and they're gonna have to fight. It doesn't have to be like a literal fight, to be clear. Again, they learn new information, and everything changes. And this is the end of Act 2A. Now we get into 62.5%. God, saying these
This is like too much math. This is too much math.
So much math.
I just do want to say later on, we will not be going over all of these percentages again each time as we break them down.
No, but giving it to you now, baby. All right, so your second pinch point is the antagonist gets another hit against the protagonist, and it raises the stakes. So this is another reminder of what your character is up against, but most importantly, it raises the stakes. Then we get to 75%, or 3/4, or 6/8. There we go.
I see you doing that math in your head.
Yes, I'm thinking. The second plot point is a dark moment where the main character questions everything, after which their allies remind them of their motivation and the stakes. This is the darkest moment, or a dark moment of the soul, or whatever else it's called.
Right.
It is also the end of Act 2B, which really should just be Act 3. Whatever. It's the end of Act 2B.
You have to whisper it so that the storytelling gods don't hear you.
They'll smite me. All right. Then we've got 87.5%. This is where the climax should begin. It's the storming of the castle in reaction to your stakes being raised. And then we get into the 98% mark, which is basically the end. It is your climactic moment. The main obstacle is overcome. The main goal is accomplished. And now we can follow it up with our lovely denouement.
Right.
The end. Jenny, you talk. My voice hurts.
That was very good. You did very good mathing. You
Thank
get a
you.
gold star today.
Yay.
Okay, so this part's going to be more fun. Let's talk about breaking down the plot points from the movie. So we can really show clearly how, like, all of these plot points and percentages and whatever come together. So I'm going to start off talking about Act 1. Mostly because then I get to make Carly talk about Act 2 and hear her get all like snarky and stuff about it again. So Act 1 is between 0 and 25%. So it's the beginning of your story through the first quarter. This is all kind of like their everyday world and the beginning of their adventure. So in the movie, at the beginning, we see Katniss in her ordinary world. She is taking care of her little sister, and we see her almost like more of a mother than a sister. In The Hook, so this would be sort of that, first chapter kind of conflict in a book. We see her strength as an archer and also kind of get hints that she's a rule breaker when another character, Gale, stops her from shooting a deer. We get hints about the world building shown through her interaction with Gale. And we also see, like, the bleakness of their life in this, like, poor district.
That's down the road from Jenny.
Right. The conflict in this portion is more about how hard their normal life is, but there are hints about that main conflict. So we get, like, Prim's dream about, that she's the one who's going to be selected. And that's where Katniss is, like, taking care of her and comforting her. Gale and Katniss talk about like how many times their names are in for the reaping. She sees the Mockingjay pin. And so like all of these like slowly get us oriented toward the main plot as we are also coming to understand what her normal world looks like. And it's also like showing us all of her motivations and, the things that are important to her. The inciting event happens when Prim's name is called at the reaping. And Katniss volunteers to take her place. I want to point out that we don't know everything about the Hunger Games and the world or even these characters when this happens. So we are at the 12% mark when this happens. But yeah, there's still a lot we don't know. Yeah. And so a lot of times when I see a story where there are problems with the structure is that we're trying to get too much information in right up front. And so that's why I kind of really wanted to point out, like, here are the hints that we're getting. Here's where the focus is. So in this beginning part, all we really need to know and what we do find out is Katniss's motivation in her deep love and sense of responsibility toward her sister, a general disdain for the reaping, and that Katniss is clever, a bit of a rebel, and has really great survival skills.
Yep.
So then the first plot point / end of Act 1 is when Katniss and Peeta are officially introduced as tribute on the televised show. And they decide to kind of play to the cameras for the sake of getting sponsors. So this really cements her as someone to watch in the games. And it also sets up a really important aspect of the main plot that will carry through the whole story, which is the relationship with Peeta. So that's where we sort of end Act 1. Is, her really kind of reluctantly embracing that she's in this now.
Here we are. All right, so Act 2A, which is 25 to 50%. This is also called like the confrontation or rising action or even like the response. This is where things are really beginning to happen. Everything's getting spicy. We're in the Capitol, and we're prepping for the games as Act 1 kind of comes to a close. So now we need to up the tension, raise the action, so to speak. So right. Act 2 starts with the first pinch point. There we go. In this movie, it's the interview where Peeta admits his feelings for Katniss. While it is Peeta making this confession, it's really the further realization that they can't win that is the antagonistic force here. So Peeta is either actually in love with her, spoilers, he is, or he is playing the game. Either way, it's a really shitty situation that they are in, and it forces Katniss to examine this situation. She's stuck here with very little power, and she's being confronted with a lot of emotions, which she is Katniss and doesn't love. She's basically reminded that if she is to survive, everyone else must die, including Peeta. And then we get to the midpoint, and this is the first day of the games, and Katniss almost dies getting supplies. The games have begun. She goes against their advice and doesn't immediately just run and hide. Instead, she goes for some supplies, which honestly isn't a bad call. But in doing so, she's nearly killed. It's only due to pure luck that someone kills her killer, and it gives her that space to escape. There couldn't be a more overt change to her circumstances here. The games have begun. Everything has changed.
Yeah, so I think that's a really great example of how that midpoint makes everything shift.
Yeah.
There's actually a craft book that's about starting with your midpoint so that you know what the shift is and can make your decisions about the rest of the plot kind of based around that.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so Act 2B starts at that midpoint, 50%.
It's really Act 3. Continue.
The third of 4 portions of the book.
Act 2B.
Right. So this is still Act 2. But as Carly said, everything changes from that midpoint. So in the movie, Katniss, from this point, tries to stay away from everybody else, which, again, not a bad strategy. Mm-hmm. She's basically focused on surviving. That's what she's good at. It's what she's used to. So she's using those skills, which makes sense. Unfortunately, the other tributes find her eventually. So this is where she finds an important ally, which is Rue. So our next plot beat is the second pinch point. Katniss releases the wasps onto the careers, thanks to a tip from Rue. And this is where their friendship and alliance really begins. It's a bit of a victory because, the careers are waiting for them to come down so they can kill them. Mm-hmm. But, she releases these wasps on them, and I think one of them dies at that point, and then the others still at least run away. But as a result, Katniss is also stung and could potentially die. Here, Rue nurses her back to health, which cements their alliance. Rue also brings up a lot of Katniss's feelings about her little sister and, comes back to that emotional wound, her motivations, all of those things. And she's kind of deluding herself into thinking maybe she can still get her and Rue both out of this alive. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you can see how this leads to the second plot point / end of Act 2, which is when Rue dies. And Katniss has this huge emotional moment, and the riots break out in Rue's district, aka the part I skimmed through because my old lady heart cannot take it.
No.
So this is Katniss's dark moment. It's really when the full weight of all of this really comes down on her, when she realizes the awfulness of her situation. I think, this is often the point in a story in which a character will, kind of give up or almost give up. And, something kind of has to pull them out of that.
Yeah.
And in this case, it's just survival still, really.
Yeah. All right. So Act 3, 4 is from 75 to 100% and is all about resolution. So this is where you really want to make sure that your characters have a hand in that resolution in finishing the story out. We don't want a Deus Ex Machina to solve the conflicts for your characters. That's usually how your reader will often feel kind of cheated. They want the characters that they've grown attached to take action and help resolve the conflict. So, Act 3 starts with the beginning of the climax, which is Katniss and Peeta being chased by the genetically modified creatures. Peeta even literally says, "The finale has begun," when they hear the creatures howling. So, thank you, Peeta, for that very specific pointer to the structure. Here, the Game Master has begun to accelerate the games to their conclusion. And that is what you as an author must do. So, we need to accelerate the plot into the climax so we can get to our exciting end of this book. So, from there, we get lots of fighting with Cato and the beasts. And then we get to our climactic moment. Cato's dead. And it's just Katniss and Peeta. And this is when Seneca announces, "Haha, just kidding. They can't have two winners after all." And Katniss and Peeta, in reaction to this rug pull, decide they're going to take the poison berries that they have together. If they can't both win, then the games will have no winner. Katniss knows they need a winner. Everyone has been saying it to her throughout the story. Oh, hey, there's a callback that threads everything together. The climax is the big, exciting moment where your character finally overcomes the main obstacles of your plot. The main conflict is resolved, and finally, we have that resolution and that denouement. Unfortunately, you have me saying denouement instead of Jenny, but you get what you get. So, a denouement is literally the untying of the knot, quote unquote. It is the end of the story where everything is resolved. So, plot threads all come together, the conflict is over, things are explained. And while I confusedly mix metaphors for you, but it's wrapping up your plot in a nice bow. It is at the same time, it's unraveling all the knots and mysteries and unknowns and obstacles that you have put in your character's way. Happy to make that really muddy and confusing for you.
So you're tying the knot and untying the knots.
Exactly.
Perfect.
Isn't that helpful? But basically, it's threading that all together, giving us that wrap up. So in this movie, we've got Katniss appearing on stage again to say how much she was in love with Peeta. We've got Haymitch and I think Cinna too, explaining to her how to cover for all of their actions that everyone's going to hate, how to make sure everything is going to be okay for them going forward. We get that nice montage of them wrapping up business in the Capitol and heading home on the train. And there's this nice little voiceover. And of course, we get to see that Seneca is punished for how he ran the games and is forced to kill himself. And the end, happy.
Yeah, so happy.
So happy.
So, yeah. So I do want to talk for a minute about there are a lot of times that we have talked about how 3-act structure is really kind of the foundation for a lot of the more common structures. And so I really just kind of wanted to talk about how that works with some of the really common ones. Mm-hmm. So Save the Cat is one that people do, the authors use a lot. So I want to talk about how it kind of lines up, because like I said, it does use 3-act structure. So I want to talk about a little about how that sort of lines up, what the percentages would kind of look like. So your opening image is kind of the same thing as your hook. It's going to be like that first, conflict that we see, the character in their everyday world. And then we've got a whole bunch of little plot points in between. And so then the end of Act 1 is in Save the Cat. They call that the B plot. It's where you start the B plot. And then like all of Act 2A is fun and games. So this is part of why Save the Cat, I think, is trickier because it doesn't have things laid out so evenly. So fun and games is like a large portion of Save the Cat. And then the midpoint is still the midpoint. So those are both going to come in the same place with Save the Cat. Then the rest of Act 2B is pretty much the bad guys close in. And then it comes back together at the end of Act 2. They call it All is Lost. That's the dark moment, Dark Night of the Soul, kind of all the same thing. Those all happen at around that 75% mark, which is the end of Act 2. And then you have a bunch more small plot beats. And then the final image in Save the Cat is really the kind of climactic moment and denouement in 3-act structure. So that's kind of how that lines up. So then another one is Story Circle. Story Circle is very similar to just 4-act structure. And it basically, the difference with Story Circle is instead of using like plot points per se, it's more focused on like zones of what the character is kind of doing at that particular moment. So like instead of having, something happen every 12.5%, it's more like this is the overall kind of thing that's going to be happening in this portion of, say, between 0 and 12.5% is they're in a zone of comfort. And then between 12.5% and 25%, they desire something. But it's still, again, based on 3-act structure. So basically, you're going to take, it has 8 points in it, and you're going to take each of those and, kind of break them into the act. So like Act 1, Act 2A, Act 2B, and then Act 3. And then, 4-act structure is basically just 3-act structure, only instead of 2A and 2B, you just have 2 and 3, which makes so much more sense.
Sure does.
It really does. But that's really the only difference with 4-act structure. It really is exactly the same thing. It's just more aptly named, in my opinion. And then 5-act structure is another one that is referenced a lot. This one is, so it is broken into 5 acts, but it's essentially that the climax, what they call the climax, happens at the midpoint. And so that kind of creates that before and after kind of movement that we were talking about, where the midpoint, creates this major shift. And so they really set that up as being like the beginning portion is the exposition. Again, they're just explaining, what the main character's everyday world looks like. Then we've got the rising action, which, as Carly told us, that is what Act 2 is. Then we get to that midpoint, which they call the climax. And then we have the falling action, which is things starting to get resolved. And then at the very end, we have the denouement. So those are the big ones that authors I know use a lot. There are tons of other ones, as we have talked about with like Hero's Journey and Heroine's Journey. Those do not neatly fit into 3-act structure, but it also is possible to use both. So like you can use Hero's Journey or Heroine's Journey to sort of guide what's going to happen, while also using the more defined structure of 3-act structure to kind of decide the pacing in between how those things happen. I'm a big structure nerd. I love it. I'm not even ashamed of it.
Yeah.
Sorry, not sorry.
Yeah.
I'll talk about story structure forever.
We can. We could do that.
It's my favorite.
All right. Well, I think that was a great point. So we have reached the end of the podcast. Next month, we are watching something more lighthearted, perchance, which is Dungeons and Dragons: Honor Among Thieves.
Yay, I can't wait.
I know, I'm really excited. And we're finally starting to recover from RevPit, and we'll be discussing that YouTube bonus content we keep promising. So keep an eye on our channel for more resources and info about the topics we've covered.
You can find our podcast on our website, storychatradio.com. You can also follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, or many other streaming services. While you're there, please leave us a rating. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at StoryChatRadio.
Thanks for joining in our nonsense.